Welcome to Red, White, and Blue. From the right, I'm Gary Pauland.
And from the left, I'm David Jones.
Tonight we have two outstanding guests. They've been with us before, David, and they know a lot about politics. Rice University political science professor Robert Stein and his equally esteemed colleague, political science professor Richard Murray from the University of Houston. Welcome, gentlemen.
Delighted to be here.
Thank you. In the interest of full disclosure, I recently attended a lecture of Mr. Stein here, so I'd like to ask him a little bit about that lecture that I received.
Because David slept through it, I think that's what happened.
And I think you predicted a Republican takeover, sweep, and all of that, but correct me if I'm wrong. Did you not do that? And if so, is that going to happen in 2012 in our esteemed county?
Well, I'll tell you what happened, and yes, I don't think it was a very hard prediction. I was a little high on probably my predictions, but proved to be correct. One that I did get right, and Dick remembers this one, I said that there'd be an unusually high level of straight ticket voting nationwide, and particularly, of course, here in Harris County. Only 14 states have straight ticket voting. And I said it would be close to 61%. I was wrong. It was 66 or 67%.
Incredible number.
But several people at that forum that we were at together were aghast, including our good friend Jerry Wood, who looked at me, and Margaret Menger, that I was crazy. It's 42 to 48 is usually what we see in midterm straight ticket voting, but of course that counted for some of the great successes that the Republicans had here in Harris County, picking up statewide, I think something in the area of there are 101 seats in the lower house of the state
legislature. So do you agree with Dr. Murray, who I also recently heard say that it wouldn't have mattered how much money the local party organization had to spend, they would have gotten slaughtered even with another couple of $1 million?
Oh, not only do I agree with it, but I think you'd have to put on several digits, and even that. I mean, we're talking about an election that wasn't local in origins, and when you see that kind of straight ticket voting, when you saw the early vote for Sylvia Garcia, if you remember that day of early voting, which we don't get the numbers of voters for and against Sylvia versus Mr. Mormon, but we saw the turnout, and we saw where it was coming from. I felt very badly for her consultant, Dan McClung, because at that point you knew this was going to be, when Sylvia Garcia loses, two-term incumbent, not a safe district by any means. Johnny Isbell gave her a good race the first time, but clearly this was a slaughter.
Sylvia who?
Well, no, she also outspent her opponent by a considerable amount of name ID, which proved in this case this was a tidal wave.
But Dick, Sylvia Garcia, as I understand it, retained about $1 million in her campaign account. So does she have anyone else to blame but herself?
Well, she should have spent the ballots down, of course. She lost about 2,600 votes. That's close enough that you can make a difference. Countywide, there's not much anything the Democrats could do. But in her race, sure, the margin was close enough that perhaps a wiser and more adequately funded campaign might have swung the election around. But usually, elections are driven by larger forces in this election, particularly because it was a national election, as Bob suggests. And California being a notable exception, it's an awfully tough environment for Democrats in 2010.
And how did we end up in that situation? Because we go from the last two election cycles, really strong backwind for the Democrats. Nationwide, even in Harris County, where both election cycles they made significant progress. So what changed?
Well, I think you had a mobilized voter base. I mean, in 2008 and 2010, the character of the electorate changed dramatically by virtue of turnout. And clearly the Democratic base, which is increasingly made up of minorities, white-collar, white voters, maybe younger voters, those voters didn't show up. You look at Sylvia Garcia, she's a majority-minority commissioner with a good Hispanic base. It just didn't show up. If it broke double digits, 10, 12%, it was a good turnout. But when you start looking at Friendswood, Kingwood, and of course Clear Lake, and you're seeing turnout rates in the mid to low 40s, that's a 2-to-1 advantage. And it doesn't take rocket science to figure out. You win elections by getting more votes, and you get more voters who show up. There was not much on the ballot for those voters. And when you start talking about older voters, white voters who are worried about Social Security and Medicare, it's one thing for the president to promise somebody health insurance in the future. It's another to threaten somebody who does have health insurance. And I think it's clear that, pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today? No. The voting base of the Democratic Party needed to be mobilized.
Well, it's a tough time now to be governing in this country. Tom Edsall, formerly of the Washington Post, had a piece a few months ago talking about how we've got very difficult long-term problems. So whoever's running the shop is going to have some bad news on their watch. When it was George W. Bush and the Republicans, they got pounded in 2006 and 8, but the Democrats had the curse of winning everything, the Senate, the House, the presidency, and pushing an aggressive agenda. and of course in a very, very difficult economic time. So they had a perfect storm. All the stars were aligned against them, and you could see this coming by Labor Day. The predictions were remarkably accurate as to the swing in Congress. There was some doubt about the Senate because there was a handful of high visibility races, and Republicans blew an opportunity in 2 or 3 states like Delaware because they had flawed candidates. But other than the suspense of the U.S. Senate, this was an election where you could see what was coming at you weeks or even months.
So
before.
if you looked at the voting, the group people who voted in 2006, 2008 versus 2010, do we find there's a significant difference in the matrix of who voted?
Oh, absolutely. If you look to the Democrats, in 06 and 08, they were able to turn out younger voters. They were able to win white, middle class, upper middle class, white collar voters, and most importantly, they were able to turn out minority voters. They were always going to win that vote. The question is, would they show up? In 2010, you just simply saw a complete collapse in that turnout.
So where'd they go?
Well, they didn't go anywhere. Let me say this.
Vacation?
And this is something I'd actually ask Dick, because I've been looking at old voter registration lists, and what I'm particularly interested in looking at Hispanic surname voters who were registered in one period and then don't show up on the list. And my suspicions are that these are populations of voters who move. They simply move from apartment to apartment or house to house, wherever. And as we all know, the first thing we do when we move is to maybe sign up our utilities, get our cable, but not re-register, maybe change our driver's license. The problem is that elections are intermittent. They're like hurricanes. In fact, they're not even as frequent as hurricanes. They have a whole season. Elections happen maybe twice a year. People don't think about it. Most people don't vote but more than once every 4 years. I think they simply are victims of our voter registration, and of course our state legislature is going to make it even harder for people to vote, maybe by requiring voter ID. But we do lead the country in early voting, but it's not altogether clear that even that helps turnout. But that's probably where they went.
Crystal ball for 2012 then, Richard Murray, is whether or not having Barack Obama on the ballot will make a significant inroad into getting some of those voters that Bob says that were left behind back, such that the courthouse then becomes a possibility for the Democrats again.
Sure. It's a very, very different election. You have about 60 million people voting in 2012 who didn't vote in 2010. A few million people have died. A lot of people have turned 18, 19, or 20 since the last election. And participation is more balanced. Now, here in Harris County, voting was actually pretty heavy among blacks, but it's very low among Hispanics. And independents broke sharply Republican. And that meant that down-ballot Democrats didn't have a chance in Harris County, but they have a chance in 2012.
So we have sort of a quiet race war going on, don't we, at the ballot box? In Fort Worth, 60-some-odd percentage voting for straight tickets, Republican judges kept in office. Dallas, just the opposite, Democrats kept in office. Here we have white voters who mostly vote for Republican judges, and they stayed.
Nothing new about this. I was digging through my old files the other day and looking at 1962, Barbara Jordan's first countywide race here. She won one white precinct in the entire county. Deer Park, there was a strike going on at Shell Oil. 2 years later, she ran again countywide, didn't win a single white precinct in Harris County. Racial voting is not new, but with particularly a black president as the leader of the Democratic Party, it's become sharply more visible. Blacks turn out in very heavy numbers, vote overwhelmingly Democratic. But unfortunately for Democrats in Texas, they are only 12% of the total electorate, and we're particularly a racially polarized state.
Do you think, since we now have moved into a legislative session where it's clear and fair to say Republicans basically run everything, save and except the Senate, with the two-thirds rule, if that applies to everything, is the same thing that happened to the Democrats in Washington going to happen to the Republicans in Texas? Because Texas does face challenges.
Well, I think there's another cleavage here that we have to at least pay attention to, and that's regional, suburban, rural, and urban. You're going to see in the redistricting West Texas lose a lot of seats. We've grown 21%, but we haven't grown evenly across the 254 counties. So there are lots of Republicans in West Texas who have economic and agricultural interests, and they're going to be concerned. So there's another dimension here. But yeah, the Democrats are going to be squeezed out. However, there's 101 House seats in the State House, and it's going to be awfully hard with the demography and the Justice Department looking down our shoulders. We're a voting rights state, that you're going to be able to protect all of those newly elected. There were 15 that didn't vote for Strauss. The majority of the Speaker of the House, they're not likely to be treated very carefully. I do think the Republicans will lose some seats. They will hold on to a prohibitive majority. And the real question is this. Tell me if I'm wrong on this, Dick. I counted 49 members of the Texas House. 40 of them are African American and Hispanic. 2 of them are Asian, 7 of them are Anglo. And I counted, I think, only 2 women Anglos. Everybody else are Anglo males. That's not the base the Democratic Party wants to start with. And right now, with Mr. Aaron Pena moving to the Republican Party, it's conceivable and not unlikely that there'll be 3 Republican congressional seats, 1 held by an Hispanic. I don't know what's going to happen to Gene Green, who is our only other. We have 2 Anglo Democratic congressmen, Mr. Doggett and, of course, Gene Green. And Gene Green represents a majority Hispanic district. It's conceivable that he may be out, an Hispanic might in, but if I'm not mistaken, 3 Republicans took House seats from 3 Democrats. 2 of them are Hispanic surnames. It looks like the Hispanics are doing better in the Republican Party right now than are the Democratic Party.
How long will that last if there's an anti-immigrant fever that seizes Austin and we have Debbie Riddle of Houston passing legislation that says, you know, if you've got a brown skin and an accent, you're going to have to be detained and talk to a cop a lot longer?
Some Republican Hispanics were elected, but generally they were elected with votes from Anglos. Hispanic vote was fairly Democratic in Texas in 2010, as it was nationally. Difference in Texas was turnout was extremely low, unlike in California and Colorado and Nevada, where Hispanic turnout was high and Democratic percentages were robust. So the big question in Texas is participation. I don't think we're going to see a dramatic shift in Hispanics. There's a significant Republican minority in Texas among Hispanics, but in every election they produce Democratic majorities. But the level of voting, it's going to go up some just by the sheer growth of population. But does it go up the way it did in California after 1994? There, what triggered dramatic Hispanic growth was a series of rather harsh measures trying to deny children that were not legally in the country access to public schools, for example, that produced a sharp increase. That's possible in Texas, but none of us, knows how that's going to play out. But that's one of the big questions going forward in our state. What about the Latino community here?
It's interesting. Collin County, it's a bedroom county north of Dallas. It had a very, very high turnout. But Collin's been doing something for about 3 election cycles that's unusual. They're having early voting on Election Day. They let you vote anywhere you want. They have their same precincts, but they say you can vote wherever you want. They have a very high turnout. They've had high turnout in low constitutional elections. Here's what's interesting. The group that most benefited from that opportunity of going to the DART bus station or anywhere you want along the I-35 corridor turns out to be Hispanics. Very mobile, often working in Dallas and traveling back and forth. This reform that Collin adopted, Lubbock has, and a few other counties are looking at it. Everett and I think Galveston are talking about doing it. It's spreading around the country and started in Colorado. It may be the way in which to increase voter turnout. The problem is Hispanic voters will more likely vote when there are Hispanic candidates on the ballot. Absent that, turnout, as all you guys know, is a party-based activity. And the party in Texas, Democratic Party, is not a strong party, has no money. And unless you have candidates like Bill White, who were not really that wealthy, they're not going to turn out a lot of voters. So the real question becomes, who is going to provide that base for mobilizing
and David
Hispanic
Dewhurst.
votes?
David Dewhurst will be running for the Senate because K. Bailey Hutchison is not going to be
Is that
there.
based on your conversation with him, David?
And he could buy that seat, could he not?
Well, can he buy the primary? I think for him, the critical election is the March primary in 2012.
And there'll be a runoff because there's going to be a lot of people running.
Clearly, people are not going to stand aside and let him have the nomination now that the senator's announced she will not be a candidate. And I agree with Gary that with a bunch of candidates running, nobody can get 50%. And runoffs are always tricky, particularly primary runoffs, because turnout is really sharply lower. If you get a Tea Party-backed candidate in a runoff, Dewhurst may experience the same thing that Mike Castle did in Delaware. Castle was a former governor, the only Congress member representing the entire state, a shoo-in in November, but Christine O'Donnell ambushed him in the primary. And Dewhurst is very vulnerable if there's a coalescing behind a single candidate. And so the runoff really hurts Dewhurst because he almost certainly can lead in a first round of voting, wealth plus great name ID and a lot of obligations. But he's not home free until he gets out of that April runoff.
Who runs for the Democrats?
Well,
what about Rafael Chia?
What about Hector Uribe, who I thought was the most talented person that I saw across the.
Same except these guys.
I mean, my sense it doesn't really matter because unless it's a David Dewars type candidate, a candidate who can, what did the Dick used to say, shave the face of his donor every morning, who's so independently wealthy, is their quote. It's just going to be tough because there's no organizational infrastructure. Any Hispanic surname candidate needs an organization that goes beyond the candidacy, and I just don't think it. John Sharp, Bill White are clearly candidates that are going to be thought of, but I don't think Bill White's going to come after what was a very disappointing and smarting election, make a run within 2 years. And John Sharp has said he's a candidate no matter what. He was there from the beginning, and I expect he will be. But clearly what you need is a good organizational base. Trial lawyers are not in an ascension now, so where does the Democratic Party build their base, and how do they build that base? And I think that's a real challenge. I was at a convention this last couple of weeks ago where the Democratic County Party was having that conversation. Keir Murray, Dick's son, and I were having this conversation, and there wasn't an answer to that. Where does the Democratic Party build that base? They've got a base, but it takes money, it takes organization, and it has to move away from candidates to do that. It has to be a permanent organization. The Republican Party has been doing that since Ronald Reagan and doing it much better than the Democrats.
And with controlling redistricting, Dr. Murray, does that mean that the Republicans are going to be basically running Texas through the rest of the decade?
Well, I would expect that they will have a near lock on the state Senate and will continue to have a sizable majority in the House delegation in Washington. The state House is trickier. The districts are much smaller, 150 of them. In the big urban counties, you can't get cute with redistricting because you can't cross county lines. And the big urban counties are the place now where the Democrats do have a substantial vote. So there's going to be some shift of seats, perhaps quickly in 2012, but gradually because of the changing demographics of the state. And the House districts reflect that demography much more quickly than Congress or state Senate districts and are somewhat less susceptible to
how's Harris County going to be affected by redistricting?
I'm probably going to lose a seat.
In the State House?
Yeah, in the State House, I think we'll probably lose a seat. We'll go down to 24.
But we'll gain 2 congressional seats.
Well, we might, but I'm not betting on that. I'm looking at Dallas, clearly one in the Valley, West. I think you'll get one on the west side of Harris County. It's not obvious that... I think the other part of the story about how the Democrats do has a lot to do with issues. The demography is undeniable. We are growing. We're growing as a Hispanic state. And the simple fact of the matter is the 4 of us sitting at this table are going to be distinct minorities, not just because we're white, but because we're old. Now, for some of us who are healthy...
Something will take care of that.
A bicycle, actually. Yes. But the problem is people live longer and they pay property taxes. And when they look at their public schools, for instance, though none of us probably have children in the public schools anymore, we're still paying taxes. And the really interesting question is, without land use controls in this state, those property taxes and those schools are the best protection we've got for our property values. I suspect that you'll start seeing a lot more voters like you and I, the 4 of us, paying a lot more attention to schools, not because we have kids there, because it's a suck on all of our revenues, and we're going to know that those schools have got to be productive in producing kids who can pay our taxes as we live longer. And I think the fact of the matter is you'll start seeing a lot of property tax owners, property tax payers, worrying about schools in ways that have little to do with what they traditionally worried about. Where's my kid going to school? Is he getting into college? They're going to want to know, is this working for us? Not only in terms of dollars, but producing productive capital and labor that will be able to work at Rice University, U of H, and make money.
Polling data says that I read recently said that the voters are not going to be happy with the legislature and the statewide office holders there if they cut into public education and health care. They don't want to see cuts there. Is anyone listening in Austin, do you think?
The problem with the public is they don't have to balance the public checkbook because voters won't lower taxes, but they also value services like highways, a prison system, the schools particularly, universities somewhat less so. But 44% of the state's discretionary budget is public schools. If you're going to get significant savings on the budget side, you've got to cut education. Higher education, which has less support, is only 12%. So mostly it's health care and education. So sure, the legislature is going to have to make some hard calls. At the end of the day, I think they will raise some more money. It looks like the governor's hedging on getting some more money out of the business tax. Gambling now has some outside chance of coming in as a revenue generator. That polls best among Texans if we have to find more money. And we almost certainly have to dip into the rainy day fund, which is tipping up toward $10 billion.
You know, Illinois just recently ratcheted up their corporate and personal income tax, and this is going to be the great experiment. governors nearby states like Wisconsin are now inviting businesses there. This is the whole welfare magnet argument.
Yeah, we get Continental United to get out of Chicago, come back to Houston.
Bob Stein, don't forget to tell this part. The governor of Illinois, the one who was elected, campaigned on we are going to have to raise taxes, and he was elected on that campaign.
But remember, it was a lame duck session of the Illinois legislature that did that. So the real test, it's a natural experiment for people like Dick and I who love to see things really play out. It'll be interesting to see because I'm not convinced that voters won't increase taxes when they're confronted with this problem of losing revenues. Look at our own city of Houston. Not by a big margin, by 6,000 votes, we voted to impose, I'm not certain every voter knew what we were doing, but impose a fee on us for water and sewer, for drainage and road construction. Of course, we'll find out how the voters feel about that when that comes in, but the interesting thing is you're seeing a lot of polling among older voters that are quite willing to support increases in Medicare and even Medicaid in order to keep those services. I think what Dick is saying about that poll is absolutely correct. A lot of voters don't want things cut, but they don't know what they really cost. And when they see, we're in a biennium, that means every 2 years. They'll have to sit around and wait 2 more years as their roads don't get repaired, as their schools are road, as their tuition at colleges. And then they may come back, not vote Democratic necessarily, but tell some of those Republican legislators, remember, there's a big gap between a guy like Strauss and some other more Tea Party-oriented people like Ms. Riddle, or for that matter, even more moderates, from Pampas. And it's not altogether clear that every Republican's going to look lockstep. When you have 101 Republicans in the legislature, even if the 15 didn't vote for Strauss, there's still a lot of people across that ideological spectrum that might be right of center, but not all that right of center.
I think the most interesting part of Texas to look at politically is the suburban area. The rural areas are heavily Republican, but declining in population and are going to lose legislative influence. The suburban areas of Texas have the best public schools in our state. They also tend to vote Republican. They have Republican members in Austin. Those are the school districts that are most fiscally stressed right now. So the members that represent those districts, the superintendents and the parents in those mostly Republican areas are going to be at the center of this crunch because it's the Humble School District in Kingwood. It's the Cy-Fair District in Northwest Houston that are confronted with dramatic increases in enrollment. They have good public schools that are valued by their local residents. They vote Republican, but they got to have more money. So, how do you solve this problem? They are not in favor of dismantling the public schools out there. There are very few private schools.
I know David has an answer.
In these suburban areas.
What Dick triggered in my thinking here was voting Republican and whether or not it's possible that we could see a Republican mayor, such as Gary's friend Paul Betancourt in the city of Houston. It was a big story about that, and we have redistricting coming up for the city. So now you guys get to speculate about the possibilities of the Betancourt mayoralty.
It would take a perfect storm. Some years ago, you remember Bob Lanier ran with Sylvester Turner, and of course the 10-year incumbent or 5-term incumbent Kathy Whitmire. The demography was different. The distribution. This is a solidly Democratic state, and I don't think Paul can afford to give up his lucrative business as a consultant. The real issue is, I think, whether or not voters in this upcoming election will use some of these issues to press some of the single-member district council.
Well, I was going to ask: Is there anyone who could run for mayor that could give Anise Parker?
It would have to be a three-way race.
A problem with one person running against her is, as Bill King, who comments in the Houston Chronicle frequently on city issues and himself has thought about running for mayor.
Yes.
The city electorate, the people who vote in city mayor elections, about a third are white Republicans. About a third are black Democrats, and about a third are Anglos that lean Democratic and independent. Mayor Parker is like Kathy Whitmire. She's rooted in this white Democratic progressive force. If one person runs against her, say an African American like Gene Locke in a runoff, she carried every white precinct, every Republican precinct against the African American Democrat. Okay, what if a Republican runs against her? Well, how does that Republican go around Mayor Parker and get black votes? Like Mr. Betancourt. When he was running as a listed Republican on the ballot, he averaged a robust 3% in the black community. So
that doesn't get him there.
It takes a three-way race.
So where are the two council seats likely to be?
They have to be somewhere largely west of Main Street. The growth in the city is toward the west, and so the east districts get slightly smaller, and you put the two new districts somewhere largely west of Main Street.
I would watch for what I will call a kind of melting pot district in the inner part, probably parts of the east side of District C, which would run, let's say, from Fondren all the way down to the Heights and Montrose. I think there's a concern that that inner city doesn't have a rural representation. The Ashby high-rise fight was a good example of that. The gay and African-American community and Dick referred to white progressives. Ellen Cohn, as you all know, has announced that she wants to run for council. She'd like to do a District C. Well, it won't be the same District C that Clutterbuck represents. She might run at large. But I think that's a kind of district that the city, my colleague Steve Kleinberg would refer to as sort of a melting pot district. The numbers on that remain to be seen because, as Dick said, the growth is on the west side. Remember this consent agreement with the Justice Department 31 years ago, I'm hoping I've got my dates right, required that we go after 2 million population, 2 new seats, and most think it'll be an African-American seat and an Hispanic. African-American possible, west side of District C can do that.
The last prediction for 2011 was this one. Thanks, Dick Murray. Thanks, Bob Stein, for being here. Enjoyed it very much. We invite you to visit our home online at HoustonPBS.org. Click on the local program bar at red, white, and blue. Read about our guests, the shows, follow-up discussions, and all that. And until next time, get informed and get active.